All right, we'll go ahead and get started. This is Chris Berry with Castle Wealth Group. So we do these weekly wisdom webinars every Wednesday, just answering questions that are submitted either ahead of time or while we're on the Q&A. And I always like to start with a positive focus, just something positive that's happened over the last week or so, and whether personally or professionally. So this past week, last Friday, I attended a continued education workshop for lawyers talking about the bill that just passed, the one big, beautiful bill that passed July 4th. And then, yeah, the one question we had submitted. So if you do have additional questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A. But let me pull up the one question that we had. It was on the bill, which kind of works out nicely. Yeah, so the question is regarding the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Some say this is the biggest retirement reform in a generation. Do you agree? And what's the most exciting or positive changes in your view? Okay. So, seems like in this time, everything is a little bit politically charged, so I want to keep the politics out of everything. Um, and really just look at this from a kind of legal financial tax planning standpoint. And so we had this bill that was passed July 4th. And what I would say within the last 5 to 8 years, there's been three really big estate planning and tax law bills that have been passed. I'm not going to say one's greater than the other, but I think it would be helpful just to kind of go over the timeline and also understand with this bill that was passed July 4th, there's a lot of things. It was 900 pages. So a lot of people are still like digesting this. Like I said, I attended a continuing education workshop on it, specifically for kind of high level estate planning and LOL attorneys. Um, and there's some interesting things with it, uh, but we're not quite sure how this is going to 100% shake out. So what I think would be helpful is just going through probably the three biggest tax bills, estate planning bills that have been passed over the last, say, 8 years. And so we're going to have to go back to 2017. So in 2017, we had what's called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Okay. And it became effective 2018. And the biggest thing out of this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that it lowered marginal income tax brackets across the board about 3 to 5%. So your 15% tax bracket moved back to 12. Your 25% tax bracket moved back to 22. Your 28% tax bracket moved back to 24. Um, and so the interesting thing about that was that it basically created one of the lowest tax brackets we've ever had in history. And the interesting thing is, at the time, the federal deficit was continuing to grow. I remember going back to 2015, we're talking about this 15, $16 trillion deficit that we had. And so it was interesting that we were making tax cuts, even though we had to figure out a way to raise tax revenue because this deficit has continued to grow. And I would say with all of these tax bills that have passed, the one concern I have is just the deficit, which has continued to grow. So 2017, we passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The most important thing to take away from that is that it artificially lowered tax brackets from 2018 till 2025. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was set to expire in 2025. That would be the last year, which means in 2026, across the board, taxes are going up at least 3 to 5%. Okay. Not even taking into account the deficit and how we had to raise tax revenue. It's just saying the law says that taxes are going to go up 3 to 5% in 2026. And as I'm talking about this, I want you to think about your like tax deferred accounts, like your 401ks, your IRAs, your 403bs. money you've never paid tax on, you're always going to have to pay tax. It's just a matter of when and how. So we had this period of time, assuming they maintained the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, where we knew in 2026 taxes were going up. Okay. So that was 2017. So that was very impactful. And that's where we started really banging the drum. And we're doing this even before as the deficit was continuing to rise of, hey, maybe there should be some strategies of looking at taking money out of your pre-tax accounts, like your tax deferred IRAs, 401ks, maybe doing like Roth conversions or trust conversions, paying the tax, even if you don't need the money, but now invest it like post-tax. So we were talking about that even before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And then when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed, we're like, wow, what a unique opportunity. We think taxes are going to have to go up in the future because this deficit continues to grow. And the government from 2018 to 2025 is saying that, hey, we're going to even lower taxes. So this was an amazing window of opportunity to move money from your pre-tax accounts, pay the tax, and invest it post-tax. So we've been banging that drum. And if you're working with someone who's not talking to you about that or didn't talk to you about that, you kind of missed a big window of opportunity. So that was really important from a retirement and tax planning standpoint. And really what I'm focusing on is the stuff that affects like retirees or individuals. I'm not talking about corporations and all the other things. There's a lot of things that went into the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as well as some of the other bills I'm going to talk about. So that was excuse me, 2017. And that became effective 2018. And then what happened in 2019 is the amount of debt continued to grow because the government didn't cut spending. They tried to play around with printing more money to do, but that created more inflation. But regardless, like both sides were spending. And then we went from prior, like 2015, I remember attending some workshops where we're talking about where the deficit's going and how that's this huge concern for a lot of clients, even before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So they passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I'm like, wow, what a unique opportunity. So we're really focusing on moving money out of pre-tax accounts, paying the tax, doing Roth conversions, things, trust conversions, things like that. And then in 2019, we were at $22 trillion worth of debt. And in 2019, the government passed probably, I would say, not trying to order these, but just in terms of time frame, this was the second big tax bill, estate planning bill that got passed. And this had probably, I would say, more of a effect on retirement planning, tax planning, especially estate planning. They passed the Secure Act. So Secure Act 1.0. This was passed in 2019. And the Secure Act 1.0, it did two main things from a retirement and legacy planning standpoint. First of all, what it did is it pushed back the required minimum distribution age, the RMD age, the age you're forced to take money out of your pre-tax accounts. It pushed it back from 70 and a half to 72. So I was a fan of this because no one really knows their half birthday except for my kids. They expect a birthday present or a half birthday present. So because think about it, like what is the year you turn 70 and a half? Most people don't know that off the top of their head. And then all of a sudden now they have to start taking money out of those pre-tax accounts. Because again, I want you to think about, as we're talking about all these things, think about your pre-tax 401ks, IRAs, 403bs, tax deferred accounts that you didn't pay tax on. Whenever you take the money out, or if the kids take the money out, they have to pay tax on. So the first thing it did is it pushed back that RMD age from 70 and a half to 72. And then we also had like Secure Act 2.0, which pushed it back from 73 or 75. Okay. But I'll tell you, that's not the main reason why they passed the act. I think what they were doing there was to push back the idea of full retirement age for Social Security, which is a completely different conversation of how Social Security is bankrupt. I think they were setting the stage to push back full retirement age for Social Security from 66 and change, or 67, depending on when you're born, to maybe 70. So they're just setting the stage for that. But the real reason why they passed the Secure Act in 2019 was at the time we were $22 trillion in debt. And even in 2019, just the interest alone on that was greater than our defense budget, which is crazy to think about, right? So, so I think in 2019, the government was basically waving a red flag to say, hey, we need to deal with this debt crisis. We need to deal with this debt hole. And we need to figure out a way to fill that hole. And so what they did is they actually looked around and they saw that everyone that has a tax deferred 401k or IRA money, they added up all of that up for Americans. And they realized there's $26 trillion sitting untaxed in 2019 in these traditional 401ks and IRAs, 403bs, tax deferred accounts. So you have a $22 trillion hole, $26 trillion of untaxed money. How can we fill that hole as easily as possible? Well, they realized they could not come after you because we're going into election year. So with the Secure Act, what they did is they realized that the kids are just happy to get anything. And so the big thing that the Secure Act did is it did not raise taxes for you, because they knew if they were going to do that going into election year, like, you're not going to vote for anyone. And so what they realized is the kids are just happy to get anything. So the real thing the Secure Act did in 2019 is said that prior to the Secure Act, if anyone other than a spouse, and there's a couple exceptions, but like kids who have disabilities, things like that, but anyone other than a spouse, if they inherit any pre-tax dollars, like an IRA or 401k, instead of them being able to stretch the taxes over their lifetime, they now have to pay all the taxes within 10 years, okay? So the idea was that hopefully you pass away, leave this money to the next generation, your 26 million or trillion dollars of untaxed 401k money, IRA money, that's going to fill the $22 trillion tax hole. So the government was basically waving a red flag to say, hey, we need to deal with this debt crisis. We need to fill that debt hole. And so that was their hope, is that, okay, people will pass away, they'll leave it to the next generation, and then over the next 10, 15, 20 years, as people pass away, all the kids will pay the taxes within 10 years. Boom, we're out of the deficit, right? And so in 2020, when it became effective January 1st, because they passed this like 2019, like right before winter vacation, and it became effective like January 1st. So it kind of ruined my vacation because we had to figure out what this, I think it was a 600-page bill, meant for all of our clients. And so like beginning January 1st, and then like first week of January, we had like all the national experts, all the research, kind of distilling this 600-page bill down for all of us advisors and attorneys. And so probably mid-January, we started doing educational workshops just for our clients. We would do these Secure Act workshops at our different locations. It'd be at about an hour, hour and a half workshop just on this bill because of all the changes it made. Not only for what it means for your retirement, but also what it means for your legacy and estate planning. So I think that was if you're to like gun to my head, what was the biggest change? That Secure Act probably is the biggest change that we've had in terms of retirement and tax planning. Because not only did it change kind of retirement age, it set up changing full retirement age for Social Security, which has not happened yet. But really it changed how we are leaving things to the next generation. Because prior to the Secure Act, we would set up separate trusts just to stretch out those retirement accounts over the lifetime of the kids and then even the grandkids. Like there were strategies where we would leave the IRA money not to the kids, but to the grandkids because they could stretch this out over a much longer lifetime. But the Secure Act changed that. So anything you're leaving to a trust or to anyone other than a spouse, individual beneficiary, a kid, a child, they have to pay all the taxes within 10 years. So I think that's probably one of the biggest estate planning, tax planning, financial planning, law changes we've had over the last couple of years. because they were trying to fill this $22 trillion deficit with trying to get access to the $26 trillion of untaxed retirement accounts, right? And so we started doing workshops just for clients over the last 15 years at that point to educate them on the changes. And we were doing these in mid-January, February, March. And then what happened mid-March 2020? The pandemic, right? And so what did the government do? Shut everything down, and whether right or wrong, it threw money at the problem. So now we went from 2019, $22 trillion in debt, 2025, at this point, we're $37.1 trillion in debt, right? And so I think that is one of the biggest things. Like my kids are 12 and 14. Like it's like if you continue to run up a credit card, what's going to happen in the future? Like bad things. And then, so we knew like coming into this year, as we're going into the presidential election, we knew there was going to be some tax changes because the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was going to expire in 2025. We had this huge debt. So we really thought like taxes were probably going to be the most important issue to deal with, especially that deficit. And so July 4th, we got the one big, beautiful bill that got passed. And it was a 900-page bill. And a couple things with that. And again, not to get political, but the interesting thing with it is that a lot of the provisions don't take in effect until 2026, 2027, which is maybe after another election process, or at least for like Senate and the House of Representatives. So that's one interesting thing. And there are a lot of provisions that have to do with Medicaid and things like that. But probably the biggest takeaway from the bill that got passed July 4th, just at least short term, is that it has made the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act tax cuts permanent, meaning at least for the, well, permanent for the government means permanent differently for the rest of us. Permanent for the government means it's permanent until they make a change. So until maybe another administration, or if there's a switch in like the House and Senate, then there could be a change. So understand, while it says it's permanent, it just means there's not a sunsetting provision, because the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act had a sunsetting provision that was going to sunset in 2025. So the one big, beautiful bill that has made it permanent until they make another change. So what that means is this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which has cut taxes about 3 to 5% across the board, we know that we're going to have at least another year or so under these same tax brackets. And you also couple this with the fact that if you look at the analysis of the bill, it's still going to add another 3.2 or $3.4 trillion to the deficit. So at the end of the day, we're going to now be $40 trillion in debt. And if you look historically, neither side has necessarily cut spending. They just spend on different things. Even this bill has added more to the deficit. We can't print more money because we already have inflation issues. And again, neither side cuts spending. They just spend on different things. So I think we're just kind of kicking the can down the line of, at some point, we're going to have to put on kind of our big boy pants and understand that we just can't keep running up this deficit. And that's where, again, a lot of people, I gave a workshop today. If I were to ask you, do you think taxes are going up or down in the future? Like, I would say half the time, or half the time, 90% of the time, everyone raise their hand and say taxes are going to have to go up. And so with this one big, beautiful bill, I would say the most important thing is understand that it extended the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, again, permanently, but that could be another year or two. So I would say that this window of opportunity in terms of moving money from your pre-tax accounts in a strategic manner, I'm not just saying cash out those accounts, but look at your tax brackets. Because most people think those tax brackets are going to have to go up in the future. Because right now we're at one of the lowest historical marginal tax rates ever in history. The highest tax bracket right now is 37%, which is one of the lowest it's ever been historically. Uh, and I'd ask you this question. Do you remember Ronald Reagan? And do you remember what he was doing before he was a politician? He was an actor. And do you know what the highest marginal tax rate was when he was an actor? It was 94%. 94%, which sounds crazy, but understand before he was president, we were at a 60, 70% tax bracket. And understand the deficit was much lower back then. And at some point, we got to raise the tax revenue to pay off, think of it as these credit cards. Like, we got to pay off this deficit. Because what are the options? We can either print more money, which will create inflation, cut spending. Neither side has done that, and no one likes it when it happens. You saw this administration try it at the beginning of the year, and you saw the outrage. Or are they going to have to raise taxes? And the big thing I want you to take away is that if they raise taxes, like if taxes go up 10%, what happens to the value of your traditional 401ks and IRAs? They're going to drop 10% because you might look at your IRA, see $1 million, but do you really have $1 million there? No, it's $1 million pre-tax, which means that if taxes go up 10%, understand you always have to pay tax on that money unless you have charitable intent. You always have to pay tax. So if taxes go up 10%, the value of your retirement accounts drop 10%. And what does that 10% represent? That represents 10% of your working years wiped out because taxes went up. So I think taxes are one of the biggest risks and biggest opportunities. And I would say my biggest takeaway from the bill that was passed July 4th is that it's just kicked the can down the line a little bit, where we are going to maintain these, I would say, artificially low tax brackets for at least another year or two. But at some point, taxes are going to have to go up. So what is the action item for you? I would say if you're near retirement age, think about taking the pre-tax dollars that you've accumulated, paying the tax now and investing it post-tax. I would rather pay a 22 or 24% tax now than a 25, 28 or much higher tax in the future. Or if you're still in an accumulation phase where you're still saving, maybe you don't save all your money pre-tax, which is what the previous generation did, because it was kind of beaten into everyone's head to defer paying taxes as long as possible with the assumption that we're going to be in a much lower tax bracket in retirement. And I'll tell you, sitting down with clients, they're finding they're in the same or if not a higher sometimes tax bracket in retirement. So understand there's a lot that goes into the one big beautiful bill. It was 900 pages. I'm guessing even the people that passed it, they didn't read the whole thing. There's some things with regards to Medicaid cuts and cuts to other programs. And the interesting thing is a lot of those aren't happening until the next election cycle. Uh, so I wouldn't say this is the biggest change in terms of retirement planning. I would actually say probably the Secure Act was, as well as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but this is just kind of maintaining that. And again, the big concern I have is just the deficit. This bill is scheduled to add another 3.2 to $4 trillion to the deficit. So now we're going from 37.1 trillion to over $40 trillion. And you look at the government back in 2019, when we're at $22 trillion, then the government was waving a red flag to say, hey, this is too much debt. We got to deal with it. A couple of questions. What is the tax rate for billionaires? So that's kind of a loaded question. But again, tax rates are going to apply the same to everyone. But I would say there are strategies where you can save money in tax-free ways. Um, that's where I'll tell you what kind of some of the more wealthy people do is they will have an asset and they will take income, but they'll take the income as a loan off of that asset. So the very wealthy, and there's documentaries and you can read about this, but they'll buy like very expensive art. They won't display it. They'll hide it away in a warehouse, but now they can take a loan off of that and they can take the money off of that loan, use that as income, and it doesn't show up on your taxes. A way that we do this more for the middle class is we can look at things like cash value life insurance, where now you get a death benefit, but you can take loans off the death benefit. But understand there are ways, even not for billionaires, for average people to look at rearranging their assets in such a way that they're going to be in a better position moving forward and make their retirement much more tax efficient and make what they leave to the next generation more tax efficient. And that's really what we've been talking about really since 2014, 15, when the deficit was getting to 14, 15 trillion dollars, even before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So understand, yeah, I don't want to get in a loaded question of what are the billionaires doing, but understand like some of the things that they're doing, if you're a little more strategic, you can take advantage of some of those strategies. So hopefully that was helpful. All right, another question here. I have a Ladybird deed on my Florida residence naming just one of my daughters or one of my three daughters as beneficiaries. Ultimately, all the proceeds after it was sold should go to all three daughters. Are there any tax issues for the beneficiary? What would be the best way to handle this? Yeah, so the question here, if I can restate it. So we have three kids, three daughters, and we have a piece of real estate in Florida. And the final kind of end game is we want that to go to the three daughters or three kids. But at least right now, it sounds like we've only named one daughter as the beneficiary of that Ladybird deed. Think of a Ladybird deed, it's named after Ladybird Johnson, but think of it like a beneficiary designation for real estate. So it's in your name while you're alive and well, and then upon death, it goes to whoever you've listed as a beneficiary. So if you name the one daughter as a beneficiary, that house just goes to her. So I would say there's a couple concerns. One is, yeah, there's a tax issue because now if she's supposed to pay out the other two daughters, you could get into gift tax issues. Also, there could be some family dynamic issues because now just one person is in control and the other two daughters could be wondering like, hey, am I getting my fair share? Without knowing more details, I'd say maybe it makes sense to do a Ladybird deed to name all three daughters as beneficiaries. So hopefully that is helpful. All right, that is all the questions I have. If you do have any more questions, feel free to email them over and I'll take care of them next week. With that, thank